My content marketing philosophy revolves around three different axioms. A good premise will get you about 80% of the way there. Content is a social currency. Decisions are made in Slack channel. My pregame is sitting at my desk, walking away from my desk, sitting at my desk, walking away from my desk, and pacing back and forth. What you share with people is a big reflection of who it is that you are. You don't want to be known as the person who wastes people's time sharing unuseful, not funny stuff, having to deliver on what that premise is. And if you don't, then they're just going to tune you out. What we as content marketers really have to do is understand what it is that is going to get somebody to share, and what is it going to say about that person when they share it. Because we want to make our reader look good. We need to have something to latch onto. That way we can claim a little space in somebody's brain.
Tommy, tell us a bit about your content marketing philosophy and how it's evolved over time. You've been in the game for a while.
My content marketing philosophy revolves around three different axioms. The first one is a good premise will get you about 80% of the way there. The second one is content is a social currency. And the third one is decisions are made in Slack channels. I think this is especially important to realize now because we've gone mostly remote in a lot of companies, and we're seeing so much of the decisions being made in channels that we as content marketers cannot track. So let's talk about the first one. The good premise will get you 80% of the way there. There is a lot of, it's really easy to get into the trap for us as content marketers to just produce and produce for the sake of producing and not really think about the premise of what it is that we're doing and if there's something that we can latch onto. And I'll give you a couple of good premises here. See if people in the audience can recognize what these premises are. And the first one is, this is the story of 7 strangers picked to live in a house, work together, and have their lives taped. And see what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real. I hope I'm not showing my age on that one, but let's see in the chat if people can recognize that one. Here's another premise. We follow the self-documented daily struggles of 10 individuals as they survive alone in the wilderness for as long as possible using a limited amount of survival equipment. Right? So that's another one. Would love to see if people in the chat can tell what that one is. And then a third one, this one's a little bit more popular recently. Can expert cake artists make cakes so lifelike that they are confused with the real objects that they represent? Right. A solid premise is something that we can all wrap our heads around, where it's memorable, right? Especially if you're putting a lot of ideation into this and you're really thinking about how can we wrap our heads around what this thing is really about. This show, right? We talk about content marketing philosophy, process, and pregame before we edit an article live. We need to have something to latch onto. That way we can claim a little space in somebody's brain. So a good premise will get you 80% of the way there, and people are really, really forgiving if the premise is good and they give you room to evolve. The second one, content is a form of social currency. And the way that I think about this is that when you were in high school, right? Think back to when you were in high school. You were friends with people who likely had similar musical interests, right? Or maybe college, it was movies. And it was this whole idea of what you share with people is a big reflection of who it is that you are, right? And your taste, essentially, in the content that you consume. And what I think is neat about this premise, right, or this concept of content as a social currency, especially in like B2B SaaS, is that if you're sharing with your teammates or your bosses or on social media, this is going to be a form of credibility, right? You don't want to be known as the person who wastes people's time sharing unuseful stuff or not funny stuff, and what we as content marketers really have to do is understand what it is that is going to get somebody to share, and what is it going to say about that person when they share it, and who are they sharing it with, right? We need to understand that because we want to make our reader look good, right? Or a viewer look good when they are tuned into this type of thing, that they're willing to use as their piece of social currency. And then there's a second part to that, which is return visitors need to be the North Star metric, because if you're sharing good stuff constantly, if you are creating good stuff constantly, then people are going to return for it constantly, which increases your odds of them trusting you to create good stuff for them to share with their colleagues or their peers or whatever. And then the third one, decisions are made in Slack, right? A lot of the conversations that we're having now, I know I've been part of plenty of buying committees at this point. We have all the discussions about the pain points that we have that we're trying to solve. What are we trying to do with each other? How does this help our team? And how are we trying to solve? In a lot of cases, it's more transactional. Like, how do we solve this specific problem right now? Oh, hey, we want to work a little bit better with sales, for example. Here's some ways that we can have an inroad over there, right? Different ways that we can have these conversations and these decisions. They're happening in private channels right now, which is difficult for us as marketers to track, but it's also imperative that we understand this is if we're trying to get people to make decisions to buy our products or buy our products, we have to understand what that conversation is going to be like when somebody else is sharing our stuff and making those decisions together.
Okay, so I think an easy follow up that comes to mind there is if these conversations are happening in private, every marketer that knows what they're doing understands that customer research is a huge part of making sure that your content aligns with your target audience, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
so many of these conversations are happening in private, especially at the executive level, how do you find your way in to understanding what's being discussed and then how you can actually, create content to poke at that pain or be the solution that they're looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the feedback loops that you're creating with your audience, right? And the different groups of people that you're trying to talk to. Now, what I've found, and I've seen this with the work that I've done, and I've seen this with other companies too, is that if you're connecting, if you're really resonating, one of the things that you're going to have is a lot of unsolicited feedback. Oh my God, thank you. This was so helpful. This really helped us do XYZ things. This really changed my perspective on whatever, right? And when those conversations, because the premise of what it is that you're creating is something that really resonates with someone, you're going to get that feedback, or you hope to get that feedback and have that conversation so you can start to build that a little bit more. If you're not getting that because maybe you're it's early stage startup or something like that, what you need to be doing is finding those ways to have those conversations with people, finding a reason for it. So maybe a customer case study, maybe just blind outreach, right? Where it's, hey, we're developing this thing. A lot of people, it's surprisingly enough, if you're doing the legwork, are really willing to have those conversations because we have this pain that we need to have solved, right? I can't tell you how many people I've been reached out to, or they've reached out to me and said, like, hey, you seem to be in our target market. Can you give us 30 minutes of time? I'll give you a $5 gift card to, Starbucks or whatever, just so you can see what we're doing and how we can develop this a little bit better, right? And that's more from a product standpoint, but there's always this need. And I'll give you an example. So when I was at Shopify, we baked it into our content calendar where once a week we would have a case study with existing customers. And the reason we did this was for a couple of reasons. Primarily because the way that we were approaching case studies, every other company was doing company X works with company Y and sees the results. There's usefulness to that, but what we were doing was taking more of a Rolling Stone interview approach where we wanted to understand what led to the problem and how did that happen. And in having these conversations, we were able to start these relationships with people to then say, like, what are some of the other things that you were doing? And I had one of my teammates doing these case studies, and he would always bring that feedback that he had from the previous case study into the conversation when we were having our brainstorm meetings, right? These are the things that I'm seeing right now. People are worried about, because we're in e-commerce, so people are worried about planning for Q4, right? People are wondering how they can increase their order revenue, right? Stuff like that. And the other thing that we were doing there, because we were smaller at the time, I was there for the first 1,500 customers or so, we were able to produce a lot more rapidly because we had such a small customer base to tap into. That's a little bit more difficult at the higher level, right? When you have more, more people involved in a bigger company, because you have to go through like customer committees and find like all of the scheduling and stuff. But for the most part, I've found that if you're willing to do the legwork, to do the outreach, you'll get that. And if not your customers, then people who are still experts in the field, people you can quote, and you're finding reasons to get those inroads, right? So that's a lot of the way that you can have those conversations and still make it valuable to the people on the other side and understand what those conversations are going to look like on the back end.
I want to circle back to the first thing you said about premises, because
Yes.
something I talk about a lot and something I'm sure you've noticed is that there are a lot of clickbaity premises that exist in the world right now. There's a difference between having a premise that sounds clickbaity, but then it actually delivers on value versus just having a premise that sounds clickbaity. So what's your philosophy on making sure that the juice is worth the squeeze? And
Yeah.
it sounds like these case studies were kind of a really interesting way to do that. But how do you actually make sure that if you say something that could sound clickbaity or maybe too good to be true, or it is a really interesting premise, once you capture their attention, how do you keep it? What's your
Yeah.
philosophy there?
It goes back to the customer feedback loops, right? Like once you're having these conversations with people, you're really having to deliver on what that premise really is. And if you don't, then they're just going to tune you out, right? So, but if your premise is good, right? And we found this with the show, but we've found this in other areas. If you're showing promise, if you're showing that you want to get better, right? People are willing to stick with you, but you don't want to be a liar, right? And like clickbait is now something that we kind of need. Twitter is a really great example of this, where you kind of have to be clickbaity in that first tweet, but if you're not delivering in the rest of that thread, people aren't getting anything out of it. They're not coming back. They're not engaging with the next one. They're not going to reward you with a share. And it goes back to that content as a social currency. And if you're not getting that kind of feedback, then you're going to you're having to work twice as hard to grow your audience and to, you know, create okay stuff. And you might not even get the right group of people that you want because you're not delivering. So it's really a matter of like showing promise that you're trying to get better, I suppose, if you don't feel like you're actually there, or really knowing that you're making all the effort that's possible to put it out there. And it's hard. It should not be easy. You and I know this, right? Like we've talked about this before. It needs to be hard because you need to be pushing yourself because you have a responsibility to your reader, to your audience, to the person who's spending even just a tiny bit of time with you to give you their attention. There are so many things that pull our attention away right now. So like you have to deliver on that. And the feedback loops is a big part of that. And then just monitoring how much actual feedback you're getting unsolicited.
Absolutely. I think what you said there about how you don't want to reach the wrong audience is so important,
Right.
because virality is not the same as value. And so get those feedback loops, pay attention to them, and then you can make sure that your content is actually resonating with the people that are having these discussions on social channels or in Slack groups that you're trying to reach.
If we think about this as the way to get people in the door, if you're not delivering on that right audience in the first place, you're going to have many more downstream issues. Your customer service team is going to have an issue. Your product team might have an issue. You might be developing your product in a completely different way if you're trying to get the wrong audience in there. So it's not just something where I've worked with large organizations and it feels like, you know, content kind of lives in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be that way, especially if you're trying to target a specific audience, because having that right group of people are going to be the ones that make or break what the entire rest of the company is going to start looking like. Right. So I think that's a really important thing to consider. And as a content professional too, you're not only representing your team, you're representing the rest of the company. So that's kind of another another layer to it, is like, how do we have these conversations with our internal stakeholders to
Yeah.
make sure that we're properly representing ourselves out to the market and being the tip of the spear for the rest of the company.
Okay, let's move on to the second question.
Sure.
What is your process for publishing? I know you have a lot to say on this.
I sure do. I come from a film background, right? And come from a large background of storytelling. And the way that I like to think about how our publication runs is almost like in a 4-act structure, right? So each quarter corresponds to an act, right? And then each month starts to correlate or correspond to a sequence. And then each week starts to correlate to different scenes, right? And then each article might correspond to different beats. And if I'm looking at it from this very broad perspective at the very beginning, what story am I trying to tell from beginning to end at the end of the year, right? And what themes are we going to hit? And if somebody were to read from front to back, what would be the entire picture that they would be walking away from? How do we break that down into individual themes for each month, each quarter, etc.? So with that in mind, right, I will then hold a brainstorm session with my team, and this is either once a week, once a month, whatever the time constraints allow. And in that, I look at this from we have a green zone and a red zone, and I ask people ahead of time to send their ideas in case we have some introverts on the team who do not want to share right away. But I think about this in the green zone and the red zone. So if we're in the green zone, it's just throw ideas out there because that might be something that somebody sticks onto and latches onto. We have everybody knows the theme going into it. So here are some things. I'll also share some ideas ahead of time, and then that gives people something to roll with. And then we move into the red zone. And what happens when we're in the green zone and everybody's really allowed to just express themselves and we're not in the like, well, no, that wouldn't be a good idea because like that's one of the hardest things to break people of. But if we're in that space, certain ideas will start to automatically go like, oh, that's fantastic. I could blah, blah, like people get excited about it, right? So when you move into the red zone, you take these ideas as we're going through, and you have the ones that are creating discussion and people are excited about, and then we start to apply pressure to them when we're in the red zone. And then after that, that's where we start to break out. That's where I, as the content leader, would start to break out what these individual pieces are going to start to look like and how I calendar them and rearrange them in a way that meets both the business's goals, but also the broader narrative that we're trying to tell. From there, once we have all of those individual things calendared, I haven't done this in a while, but I used to get on a one-on-one conversation with the different authors for the different pieces that they were assigned to and be about a half an hour conversation and say, this is really what I'm looking for out of this piece. I am a terrible briefer. Not going to lie about that. I'm not an outliner. I'm not a briefer. I don't work well in that zone. I know you're like very pro brief, so like that's embarrassing to admit, but what I'm doing in these conversations, especially for somebody who does outline, is say, this is what I want our reader to walk away with when they leave this piece, right? I want this to be the thing. These are the things that we're going to cover. And you can organize this in a way that makes the most sense. And more broadly speaking, I try to work with my team on story structure and the basic principles of the different elements of good storytelling. I'll share resources with what makes good stuff and so forth. But I'll have that conversation. We'll have about a half an hour discussion, and there's a Q&A. It's a very open, brief conversation where we talk about that. And generally speaking, the draft that I get back has a lot of soul infused into it, right? Because we're talking about what do I want the reader to get out of this? What's the mindset that they're in when they're coming into this piece? And I'll even ask, take 10, 20, 30 minutes to just jot down where people are at. Why would they even click on this thing? What headspace are they at that right now? What are the circumstances that are leading them to either search for this thing, or why would they even click on this in the first place? Right? List that stuff out because you can start to incorporate that into the article when you go to edit. And then from there, once we get the piece, right, it's a matter of going, hey, did this hit those notes that we were talking about? We have very clear expectations moving into it. It's not, I'm trying not to be prescriptive, but we have very clear expectations. And when somebody's looking at that, they're we know that we're on the same page. And if we're not, and I give certain feedback inside the edit itself, we already know why I'm giving that type of feedback, because it's something we discussed or something that maybe we didn't discuss or didn't cover. So that's sort of the process from ideation to publication.
Okay, so coming from the perspective of somebody that is obsessed with outlines, um,
Yeah.
I personally find them important because it helps to make the final editing less painful, is I
Mm-hmm.
guess the best way to put it. It's there's less back and forth. The writer has a chance to, before they spend days writing this thing, make sure that it's structured at least in the way that they think is going to align most with your
Mm-hmm.
expectations. So it's interesting to hear then from your point of view, if
Mm-hmm.
you don't necessarily expect that, how do you then, when you get that final piece, like it might have that soul, but how do you know that this is structured in the way that you think is the best for your audience?
Yeah, I think that's part of the conversation that we're having is like, what are the things that they're coming into? Like, what are the assumptions that they already have coming into this? What do we need to talk about? What don't we need to talk about? And then what's the logical progression of where they're at when they get here and where they're at when they leave here? And when we have those conversations, that's part of the conversation. And maybe it's more of a verbal outline than it is. I just don't have the patience for
Mm-hmm.
actually outlining. Like I just don't. That's just how my brain's wired. It's useful. I totally get it. Uh, but yeah, I totally understand. It's just also we'll discuss where do I want people to start, where do I want them to leave, and how do we get to that place.
So I think you've just answered it there. So it's just a good note for anyone watching. An outline in my mind is written, and in your mind it's verbal. And either way, it's helpful to have
Yeah,
a structure of where you want to start and where you want to end before you put pen to paper. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. And how you communicate that, I think, is really important too. Like, and that's going to be dependent on style, your communication style. Like, these are just things because I mean, we're having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation now, and I'm a very free flowy type of person. So it's very difficult for me to do that. But that doesn't mean we don't understand. We don't have a very strong understanding of each other. And I think it also helps us like understand each other's language or communication styles. I think anybody I've ever worked with will tell you that I'm a little off the wall and I'll rant a lot, but it's also
Absolutely.
very helpful. So my wife is producing and she just LOL'd over here. So, but yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of context. There's a lot of information that I'll put out there, and then it's like it's your job to sort of take that and arrange it. You know what I'm expecting, maybe too much, and then and how do we distill that down into something
Yeah.
that makes sense
And
for our
good
listeners?
writers are masters at listening to an hour of a ramble, as you put
Yes.
it. Not your words, not mine. um,
Yeah. Yeah. No,
and
it's true. It's true.
structuring that, making some sort of sense out of that. That is probably the
Yeah.
hardest part of writing. A lot of it happens in your head.
I want to. Can I actually add to that for a second too? Because this is actually really important to the next part into my own editorial style. I'm a super nice guy, right? I'm a ranty, like you can see where my head's at. I'm very transparent with the way that I'm thinking about this, right? Very important because we've talked about the relationship between author and
Mm,
editor and how it's a very intimate type of relationship. Um, for me, that's really important because when I'm about to go do my job and sit down and edit this piece, I'm brutal. I am absolutely brutal. And the reason for that is, and there's this dichotomy where the people I work with, I think they understand why I'm brutal because we're talking about the work itself, and they know that it's not personal because they've heard me go on in this rant and see how passionate I am about whatever it is that we're doing. Um, so they understand the like sort of bluntness of.
mm-hmm. Yes, and to anyone watching that's ever worked with me, I'm brutal too, extremely. But it's like a empathetic brutal. It's a good brutal. Okay, final question before we move into the pregame. It sounds like you plan your content out by the year. So, how do you then make space to respond to any trends that you think would fit into the story?
There are two different ways that you can be taking off. So you've got responding to trends, like you were talking about, and then you've got working with internal teams and their last minute responses. With the internal teams, it's very, very easy to start developing those relationships and saying, hey, this is how we work, this is what we do. My marketery catchphrases, I'm a chef, not a short order cook, right? Like, how can we do the best job possible and be as planned out as possible? The other side of that is something big just happened, right? Now, when I staff my teams up, I try to have uh, people who can respond fast and people who like fast writers and slow writers, I guess, if
Mm,
that makes sense. Where like some people have that skill of being able to respond and adapt quickly. A lot of journalists have that ability, right? And then other people need to take more time and be thoughtful about it. So when I structure my teams, I try to have somebody who's able to respond quickly to stuff, because if they can bang out a really solid response post to whatever's happening within a very short period of time, it's super valuable to have. And it comes down to structure.
that's so important. Having different types of writers that think differently is
Yeah.
another way to diversify your content because everybody writes differently. It takes me, I'm a very slow
Yeah.
writer. It takes me ages to write, a 3,000 word blog post, whereas I can write a thread in an hour. It just depends on the format. But yeah, if I'm writing a blog post, it takes me ages. So it's so important to have people that okay, this is what your skill is. I'm going to give you this because I know that you can just kind of like get with it. Whereas if there's something that requires a bit more research, thinking, interviews, all that jazz, yeah, you have someone on your team as well for that. Before we get to the edit, let's talk about your pregame before you edit.
Yeah, I do my absolute best not to edit. It's like I have to psych myself up. It's like going to the gym or hopping on the treadmill and having this like really, really aversion to doing the job, because it can take me anywhere between 20 to 30 hours to do a
Mm.
single edit, because I'm caring very deeply and thinking about all of these things that we've had contextually with the conversation. Um, so my pregame is sitting at my desk, walking away from my desk, sitting at my desk, walking away from my desk, and pacing back and forth about thinking, how am I going to do this and get it the way that I want? Um, and then eventually just sitting down and doing it. I'm not the type of person that like I tune everything out. I go through line by line. I'm not the type of person who can just scan it. I used to be able to just scan and say what's the structure look like and then go. I can't do that anymore. I'm very granular and in the weeds, and I'm looking at what are the things in between these lines that's not being said, and how can we start to pull this stuff out, and what are the questions, what are the different voices that a reader's reading with, because I think that there are a handful of different voices: the one who's actually reading the screen, the one that's saying how I can apply this, and then the one that's going like, what's the end result gonna be, right? So trying to speak to all three of those voices at the same time to then get all of that, how am I going to speak to that and how am I going to pull that out of this particular piece? So let me share my screen. This piece right here is a starting point about making your site more accessible. And this is a topic I've written on. I've edited this type of topic before. And the major thing that I saw with this is that if we look at the broader context of where this piece might live, and my suspicion would be that this is something that is supposed to live in a search engine. It's intended to be ranked. Um, Seeing what the search results are for this particular piece, I don't think it's going to be one that ranks, because there's a lot of authoritative pieces out there on this particular subject that will be very difficult to break into that search rank. That said, that actually gives us some freedom to bring something to the table on this conversation that normally isn't possible. So my first impression as I was reading through this was that it really hammers on that accessibility aspect from the point of um, people with disabilities. As I'm going through this, and I'll walk through a little bit more individually, but as I'm going through this, I'm realizing that accessibility now is not those things. Accessibility now is just more modern web browsing, right? So I say this right here. The article frames accessibility in a way that helps visually and audibly impaired people. Um, but, and this is a thing that I hate to say, the unfortunate reality is that for the majority of business owners, this means spending extra time and money on satisfying a small percent of their user base. The opportunity cost is just not worth prioritizing. I have had this conversation where it's how much longer is it going to take us to update all the alt text? How much longer is it going to take to make things easier to navigate? Like, that's a problem. But we can appeal to people's selfish nature by reframing accessibility to speak to being more modern in the web. So a lot of people will say use video subtitles for people who can't hear. Okay, but if we look at the research, right, I found that Gen Z 74% of Gen Z consumes video content with captions on, and they're also a great way to, and 50% more broadly of Americans are consuming most of their content with captions on. And when we pull back and we think about what that is, what that means, a lot of that has to do with our own scrolling behaviors. If we look at, there was a study that was done recently that said the average person, when you think, if you were to print out how much, if you were to print out how much you're scrolling every day, you'd be scrolling a Statue of Liberty's worth of like ticker tape every single day. It's like a CVS receipt, but worse. And we have to think about that because the captions in that regard are something that helps give context and gets people to want to click, right? It's not just for people who are hard of hearing. We can also reframe alt text as a way for increasing the odds of showing up in image search or featured carousels or any of these other new Google like search results or search features in a way that wouldn't necessarily be possible before. And yes, we do talk about it with people with disabilities, but if we're assuming, if we have to assume that our reader is advocating for these changes internally, we have to give better reasons for them to share with their boss or people who are going to make this type of decision. A few additional things to consider when we look at this piece. As we age, the demographics of your reader make a difference. As we age, our eyes let in less light. There's actually research behind this too about ideal typefaces and sizing and contrast because of the way the way you sit and how much vision comes in. There's a reason why we've adopted more dark mode. These are all have an impact on how content's delivered and how it's viewed. So the distance away from the viewer and the screen. There are different types of accessibility that we can address: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And that's not something that's really addressed in this piece. Okay. Stop me anytime, Erica, or audience, please feel free to ask any questions as I'm going along here.
Yeah, let me just, before you continue, is this research that you did independent of what you saw in the article? Like, did you read it first and then go do this research to make sure that you had a good frame of reference? Or did you sort of research based on the title and then read it?
So some of the stuff I already knew because I've done this, I've written this type of article before. And when I wrote for Conversion XL in particular, that was really, really difficult. Because of all the types of questions that would be asked. But generally speaking, I'm actually doing the research as I'm going through the piece. So if I have a question about something that pops up, I'll go and Google it real quick and say like, hey, wait a second. So a good example of this is the 74% of Gen Z consumes video content. I got maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs in, had that question, and then said, how do I verify this with research, right? Or, hey, this doesn't quite sit right with me on the reasons we're talking about why subtitles matter. Let me research that as I'm going along. So I'm like super inefficient as an editor because I will be asking these questions as I'm going through the piece and then going, let me take a look at this. Okay, now when we go to incorporate this feedback, let me share the link with you. And then here's my interpretation of it. My interpretation is not the only interpretation of it, but take from this what you will, and here's what I think, right?
And just to give another way of doing it to the audience, I tend to read a piece, ask questions, or write something like, proof question mark, And whether that's a note to myself or to someone else, I tend to stay in the writing and then do the research. But there's just too many ways to do it. So that's just two different ways right there.
Yeah. And Patrick in the chat here too says terrible sound on most videos. So he turns the captions on for that a lot. That's a really great point. Also, people are consuming content while they're at work, or you can't always listen to it and have it on, but you still want to see what the content's all about. I generally break this down into a few different pieces, Erica. I actually started getting some of the language from you. So I look at structural edits and then I look at developmental edits. I spend most of my time in developmental edits. But right here, I started taking this tip from Tracy Wallace, who will just literally go table of contents in here just to see what the subheaders are, just to see what the overall structure of the piece is. And to give this piece credit, there's a really solid start of a structure to this, right? So why is creating accessible content important? First, audit your site, then work on corrections, write accessible text, create accessible design. You guys can read the screen. I don't need to read to you. There's a lot here, and there's a lot that can be brought into it. So I'm going to start moving into the individual edits. I started doing line edits in here, and then I decided not to. So these are things that start to irk me almost right away, and I this is where having the relationship is really important. So like the truth is, in reality, admittedly, these are things where it's not totally necessary to the piece. And Daniel says, what's your stat research process? I'll talk about that in a second. These things are totally unnecessary, and it's something that I might, if I start to see some of this early on, I might end up doing a search internally for stuff like in order to, the truth is, in reality, like these things, I'll start to do a search and just search and find all and replace or whatever, try to get rid of it. Especially with somebody I've never edited before, I'll start to make these types of comments. Start to move down a little bit here more. Web Accessibility Initiative found that 1 billion people, or 15 to 20% of the world's population, have some form of disability. Okay, that's really interesting. Statista also found that 56.9% or 59.6%, right? Statista, folks, any author who's reading this, Statista is not typically the researcher. Statista is an aggregator. And if you go over here, down here in the very bottom right, if you're logged in, I'm not currently, but you can show the source and it will tell you who actually did the research. That's important, right? Because we need to make sure that we're going to the sources, especially if we're doing something from, we're not pulling from something like Statista, but we're looking at another website. Erica, you and I have talked about this before, where you need to go back to the original research. You need to see what that is, because the interpretation of that data might not be something that might not be a correct interpretation. And I've seen this plenty of times. So it's like, let's get to the original thing, and you might actually find a counterintuitive interpretation of the exact same data. So what can we do there? Okay, I do some line edits over here. And I mentioned this here. So Statista, they do original research. They're primarily an aggregator. NITA or NTIA, this is actually, it's a government website that has done the research, right? National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Way more authoritative in my mind. And it gives you different ways to visualize the information as well, right? Super important, I think, to make sure that we're going straight to the source. Let's see, going down a little bit further, right? Cut, we have admittedly, we don't need that. I added Ben Lax on. What we're looking at here too is the original sentence was, we have admittedly been made some mistakes on the Superpath website, right? I don't like saying we've made mistakes. I don't like saying that our author or our reader has made mistakes, because generally speaking, especially when this is framed up as a starting point for making your website more accessible, where we don't know, right? So it's not a mistake, it's ignorance. And it's not a bad type of ignorance. It's just, you don't know what you don't know. So we have to be respectful that the reader's not coming into this like knowing what they should have done and did it differently instead, right? That to me is a mistake. So that's word choice. But that's something I try not to like make our reader feel a little shamed when they do that. Also, none of our videos have transcript and some salary progression charts. Like this starts to feel like as I'm reading this, like I'm getting reprimanded by a parent, right? You don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this, you're not accessible. And we see this a little bit further. You don't care about your reader, or you don't care about your audience. This is the subtext, because you don't have these things done. Not a great place if you're trying to make a case to somebody about making something more accessible, right? So again, we cut here. We're not perfect. We've cut, admittedly. We've deleted some mistakes, done some line edits here. Now, this is another one where why is creating accessible content important? From a moral standpoint, if your company is committed to equality or equity, everybody should be able to access your content. Someone who is deaf or hard of hearing should be able to watch a video with captions or read a transcript. Similarly, somebody who can't see well should be able to navigate your site with a screen reader. This is where I start to see a few different opportunities, and this is really the turning point for me, where I said, like, how can we reframe this piece? Now, be able to, you can see my little emoji text here, or my emoji responses. It starts to frustrate me. But from a moral standpoint, so if I don't have these things, are you calling me immoral? Right. And then everyone should be able to access your content. Yes, that's the point of the article, so we don't need to state it again. So this is something where, yes, everyone should be able to access your content. Yes, that's the whole premise of the article. Do we need to restate it here, especially when we're a few words in, right? Patrick says, turn the captions on.
Yeah, I was going to say I couldn't tell if you were asking a serious question or if you were commenting on the article.
Yeah. So this was where this was the turning point for me. So someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, actually not necessarily, especially when we're talking about captions, right? So data from Preply indicates that, broadly speaking, 50% of Americans use caption when consuming video content. And when you break it down by age, nearly 3 out of 4 Gen Z people use caption. And this is where I say, like, that I suspect it has to do with scrolling behaviors and all the reasons why people in the chat are talking about it too. And there's also research that correlates with retention, reading text, hearing audio, and seeing images all at once, right? So we have an opportunity here to start to reframe this conversation to, instead of being like, if you want to appeal to this subset of your audience, instead it's, how can we start to help people retain the information more, right? How can we get people to absorb more of what we're trying to talk about, to be more memorable, to attract return visitors?
My thought is that this is just so absolutely critical to what you were saying about, is the piece speaking to the audience in the way that you want it to, and is it getting them to feel your soul in that way, where you're telling a story that brings them along?
Yeah.
I mean, so far, with the tone of sounding like a parent, phrases like from a moral standpoint, and then also not, digging into the data as much as they should have. It's one of those things where your audience is, if they have any idea about this in the first place, and they feel like you're patronizing them or you're misrepresenting data, you're going to lose credibility right then and there. So it's so important to consider your audience, consider what you're trying to get out of, telling this story, and to tell it credibly. Data research is really, really hard. I do want you to answer your question about how you do it, because that is one of the biggest, pain points for editors, is double checking research. And a lot of the time it's been misinterpreted, and it's not accurate. And you have to send it back and say, hey, I read this and it took me ages, but I read the whole thing and it wasn't interpreted the correct way. Like, this is what I think it says. Like, can you read it? And like, let's chat about what you think and then fix it.
Yeah. So what's the question there, Erica?
The question is, what's your process when you're uncovering data to make sure that you're actually, taking it all in and spitting it out on the page accurately and credibly?
Yeah. So I'm like a 5-year-old when it comes to this stuff, and I'm always asking why. Why is this? What is this? Like, why is this? Now that I have that information, what does that mean? Okay, now that I know what that means, what supports that? Why is that the case? And how am I getting the most complete picture of this subject that we can possibly have because um, there's always more to it. There's always more discussion. There's always more. And coming from my Conversion XL background, there was a lot of behavioral science, neuroscience, and things like that went into our pieces. So one piece that we did that's actually kind of akin to this, I got a lot of my original research on this particular subject from that, is why simple websites are scientifically better. Now, this is a topic that could be, and maybe we can pull that up or throw it in the chat or put it in the show notes, but later on in the replay. But the idea is that is a subject line by itself, is why simple websites are better. It's such a subjective idea. But when we start to look at things like how the brain perceives color, right? And how typography affects the readability of a site, and what readability has on retention. And like, if you give a mouse a cookie, right? You keep going down this rabbit hole of, what does this thing mean? Why is that the case, right? When we start to look at things like, I learned a lot about mirror neurons, right? And prototypicality, and the mirror exposure effect bias, and like all of these other things where it's like, why do these things work? Why is this the case? And I really, really think about that. And as I'm going through this, right, I either am questioning something like why someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, I'm questioning, is that really all that's there to it? Or I'm going, okay, why, if that's not the case, and we have this research that says 50% of Americans use captions when consuming video, why? Right? Scrolling behavior, all of that. So now we can start to incorporate that and restructure and reframe everything else that's going on. We talk about this too, right? Someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, like, I've already got a lot of stuff that's come out of this one particular paragraph, right? From a moral standpoint, everyone should be able to access our content. I don't want to be immoral. Yes, everybody should be able to access our content. Not everybody who is deaf or hard of hearing. It's not the only people who it's important for. Be able to. Please get rid of that. And then we go into a scare tactic here, right? There are also complex legal issues surrounding accessibility. If your site isn't compliant with the latest content, you could be at risk for a lawsuit. Like, holy cow, that escalated fast, right? So, and then we're not really following up on it too much after this. But yeah, my first response here is, wait, what? This is really interesting, but why? On what grounds? Like, I've never heard of this before. This is interesting. Let's dig into this a little bit more, right? Non-compliance issues are on the rise. According to Usable Net Report, they found that almost 100 lawsuits were filed each week, and lawsuits have increased from 3,500 in 2020 to over 4,000 in 2022. That is crazy. That is insane to me. Let's dig into that a little bit more. UsableNet also noted that accessibility widgets offered no guarantees, with 300 lawsuits against companies using these widgets in 2022. Okay. So this is something where I'm going, this is a bit where we might be missing a little bit of information, because at this point we have not given the definition of what an accessibility widget is, or why companies might even use it, right? My suspicion would be that we might use a widget as a stopgap so we can simply paste over the issue, right? But this is also an opportunity where we can talk to people who have widgets and say, like, why are you using these widgets, right? What's the point? So there's something there, right? We have a gap between accessibility widgets and this lawsuit, and then we're moving away from the lawsuit entirely. Which, like, holy crap, how do I not get sued for not wanting to do or not having alt text, right? Like, or what are people even getting sued for? I think that's also an important thing to consider.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's lacking detail. This is a perfect example of using statistics to set context and then not at all drilling down on the specifics that helps the reader understand, get ahead of any questions that this is going to pull up, which, I mean, you just mentioned a million. I'm sure everyone here has a different question that we could list from this. And then you just kind of just leave them. It's like you get them all excited. You play the first 5 minutes of a movie, and then you're like, right, let's skip the entire next scene and go to the middle of the movie. Like, what?
Right.
And it just doesn't logically flow. It's a huge friction point that's I mean, if I was reading this, I'd be straight back to Google, on another article, figuring out what the heck I just read, because I'm not going to get it here. Yeah,
Patrick
exactly.
Patrick in the chat says we can sue for not having alt text. This is the info SEO nerds need.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's true. Well, and that's the thing, is we don't know why people can get sued in here, and that's a gap. That's something, exactly. You're going to go back to Google and say, what?
Yep.
Okay, so now we move into the next section. First, audit your site. Okay, sounds good. That seems to be the whole point, right? Seeing where your site falls short can be a good starting point. Yes, this is the point of an audit. We don't need to restate the subheadline. This is something that I am bullish on every single piece I edit, where it's so often you'll see in a piece, here's the subheadline. Now let's reiterate the subheadline before we move in. And from a flow perspective, right, I like to think about this as a roller coaster, where what we see in a lot of pieces is we have the subheadline, we restate the subheadline, we build up to a point, we decrescendo, and then we move on to the next subheadline. We talk about the subheadline, we crescendo, and then we decrescendo, and then we keep going. And as a reader, when you're starting to think about how the piece flows, it feels really up and down, right? And this is something that I really look at, and that's where I come into the feeling, and how does it feel when you read this piece, is, am I going on this roller coaster ride of getting this piece, like consuming this information? And the way that I like to think about it, and the way that I try to communicate that, is less like a roller coaster and more like a waterfall, right? How can I get people to go from the top to the bottom? And the subheadlines aren't there to break up the thought. The subheadline there is to illustrate the next thought, right? Where it's more of a beat instead of a brand new thought, right? How do we look at it as a beat change, and how are we going into that beat change in a way that's a little bit more logical than what we had before, or a little bit more logical for what we've been reading before this, right? So over here, for example, with accessibility checker, you just add your URL, see your site accessibility score, and the areas you can improve. You can use a screen reader to test your user experience for the people with limited vision. This, and I hate to sound like I'm ripping on this author, right? And I'm not. I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of really good base here. But we have the audit results, and then the alt text here says screenshot of audit results from Superpath from an accessibility checker. It's almost humorous to me how the alt text does not describe what's happening in the image. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Like, this is one of those things where I don't mean to be mean on that one, but we're talking about accessibility. And maybe this is something that's changed in the publish, right? Maybe when something's getting staged, this is not going to be the thing that takes the case, But if we're going to use the alt text, and we're going to be using this from the perspective of accessibility, the alt text really needs to describe what's going on in this piece. From a contextual standpoint, that's going to give your screen readers a whole lot more to work with. That's going to give Google a lot more to work with. And it gives you an opportunity, if you just wanted to be, it gives you an opportunity to insert more keywords, right? If you wanted to go about it that way, right? So there's a way to incorporate this stuff into the alt text that could happen in here. And hopefully, I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt that this is something that would happen in staging, right? So if you find your site has accessibility errors, you're not the only one. Yes, we've established this. We don't need it. WebAIM. This is actually super interesting. 2022 study by WebAIM analyzed 1 million websites and found 96.8% violated some part of WCAG2. I don't remember what WCAG2 is, but they violated it, and a lot of people are doing that. So that's important. Sarah commented on it in the chat. Oh, hold on. Sarah, what are we saying? Okay. Wound up editing this and added an example of a lawsuit. Okay, cool. So Sierra is in the chat right now, and she is the original author of this. And there are examples in the re-edit that I have not seen. So this is a perfect example. Thank you, Sierra. And thank you, Sierra, for being a champ when listening to these edits. So sorry.
Thank you. I also apologize for any comments I make.
But there's a lot of potential here, and that's why I really care about this when we do this. Okay, so what I want to see in this though is it's super interesting. We can bring it up into the section that talks about lawsuits, and it gives me something to tie the consequences to the actions or inactions, right? Because now we're going, okay, a ton of people have this problem, right? But here are, and this is how big the problem is. Here are the things that make a problem. Now, how can we start to solve that, right? So when we can install AI powered, if we move this to bullet points into the previous subheader, the section ties together really nicely with the tools we've mentioned before, right? So all this stuff can be brought up into the earlier section, and we can make it flow a little bit better, right? Then work on corrections. Okay. Hiring developers and designers, we have a really solid opportunity here to actually beef this area out a whole lot more. So, and this is one of those things, Erica, where I go, I focus, I start to hyper focus on tiny little phrases that can help make more of the piece, right? So hiring developers and designers can make your site accessible from the back end is intimidating and expensive. While this approach is something companies can work up to once they have the budget, a piecemeal approach to making your site more accessible can be just as valid. Now, piecemeal approach, this 2-word phrase right here, spawned this whole thing for me, right? Might not be responsible for us to suggest piecemeal, but rather reframe it as incremental upgrades. We don't need to elaborate too much, but if we have a timeline and listing out deliverables within that timeline, it gives us a more concrete feel. And this can set up further structure in the following section, where we might make an effort to month 1, write more accessible text, month 2, update alt text, month 3, etc. This gives our reader a lot more tangibility to what it is that we're talking about. And it helps them when they have the conversation with whoever their stakeholder is to say, this is the plan that I want to go into with this. I know that this is a big conversation and it's sort of giant and amorphous. But if we start to break it down individually, we can do 30 pages of alt text if it's something that we're dedicating an hour to every day, or we can turn things into sentence case, or we can do all these other things. And it gives, like I said, content is a social currency. So if we can give the reader something to bring to whoever it is that they're going to make the decision to do this with, right? Now we can give them a little bit more. We're talking to that story that they're telling in their head of how am I going to do this thing? Now we have that.
Yeah. If you scroll back up to the before number 1, I completely agree with what you said. So the statement hiring developers and designers make your site accessible is intimidating and expensive. That statement alone, I feel like deserves a bit more. I don't know if we've talked about that at all. So far we've set the context about, why it's important. But we haven't really explained the process of why that would be expensive. But even if it is intimidating and expensive, my question is, but is it worth it? Is it the best way to stay out of jail? Like, I'm scared by now, So I'm curious. That's brought up a couple questions for me. And with the next sentence, something companies can work up to. What's a realistic time frame for that? That's a question I immediately have. And then I completely agree with what you said about piecemeal approach. Incremental upgrades is a more interesting way to frame it. And also, again, I'm curious about what that looks like. So those details in this paragraph before we sort of dive into the specifics really help get the reader ahead of potential questions. And that's what you should be thinking about all the time as you're writing. What potential questions are these claims that I'm making going to bring up, and how can I get ahead of them and keep them engaged enough to be like, okay, I'm with you. And now let me go continue on this journey with you.
Yeah. And thinking about this a little bit more too, and this just occurred to me while we were having this conversation, this might be, if someone's coming into a starting point, why are they clicking on this piece in the first place? A starting point for making your site more accessible. This might be a really great way to frame the entire piece, right?
Yeah.
Hiring developers and designers. We already kind of understand the problem as we're going into the piece. Now this is addressing hey, straight up, we know what the problem is. we don't even know what the problem, like, we don't just know what the problem is, we know the hurdles that you're trying to get over when you're trying to address the problem. Now, how can we take this to find other ways to enable you to address the problem internally? Here are all the things you need. So Sierra actually asks in the chat here, what would I write for the alt text as instead? That is a great question. So what I would look at here is actually something along the lines of, status not compliant. Like, describe what's happening in here. So we had 4 critical issues. We had 4 past elements with 20 items. This was good, right? Our score was a 59. Like, all of this information right here would be good. And, visual issue. In some cases, when I do alt text, and I'm not the best at this, not all of us are the best at this. Like, let's be honest, I'm not going to get holier than thou on any of this. But we can put all of this information in there. And the thing is if your images don't load on a page, like, just because you're having sort of image issues, this is still going to give people who aren't visually impaired, or it's going to give people who aren't visually impaired a still what's happening on this image. So, you could go so far as to I would just say describe what's happening on this page overall for alt text. And along the same lines as that, we're now moving into an age of AI image generation and things like that. The more descriptive you can be to an AI, the better imagery it's going to give you. And I'm trying to think of things that way now, where it's like, how can I give it more prompts to have a much clearer understanding of what it is that's in my head, right? So just some thoughts there. Read accessible text. Okay, for some people who are neurodivergent. So this is an interesting case right here. Michael Alexis, CEO of Team Building, he says, for some people who are neurodivergent, some of those with dyslexia, reading all capital letters in a word, because we're talking about sentence case here, can be more difficult. So therefore, using sentence case with a mix of upper and lowercase letters is more accessible for this audience. Now, I agree, and I know the research behind the sentence case, right? I worked with a UX team who converted me from title case to sentence case, because I was very much a pro title case, and they threw a bunch of research at me, and then I was like, okay. Problem is that this quote, to me at least, is confusing, because sentence case is 1 capital letter and then all lowercase, and then this says with a mix of upper and lowercase. That's not you saying that. That's that quote. But I would try to reframe it, because that's a little thing that's a little bit more challenging for me personally as a reader. Over here too, we hear this a lot, avoiding jargon and acronyms. As a black and white statement, I actually disagree with that. Jargon and acronyms can be shorthand, and it really depends on the reader. If I'm writing for an insurance company and the primary reader is experienced, LTD would stand for long-term disability. They would understand that. And it makes just as much sense for them as SEO is for us. We don't need to type in search engine optimization every single time. So depends on the reader. Generally speaking, that's just my 2 cents on that. And I can't really make that assessment accurately, not knowing what that reader is overall. Breaking up your content with subheadings. Yes, there's actually some really interesting research you can include here from Nielsen, right? That talks about the accessibility and scannability of websites, and how subheadings can do that and make it a little bit easier to understand. And this will make text content better for all readers. I don't like absolute statements about something that might be subjective. That's just a personal thing more than anything else. But things like better, worse, stuff like that, I just try to eliminate that from any writing that I do and any writing that I publish.
Absolutely same.
Yeah. And I'll say why for a second here too is we have a responsibility as readers or as authors and publishers to give our reader as accurate of information as possible, and leave room for interpretation for them as well. I've seen plenty of people think that they're doing something wrong because somebody else said it was the best thing or the worst thing. Yeah, Sierra says, I feel like I could write a whole article on how to write alt text. But yeah, I mean, it, we want to make sure that things are not objectively the best, the worst, and because we don't want our reader to feel like they are doing something wrong, right? Or they didn't know this, and because they didn't know this, like this spreads throughout organizations, it spreads throughout communities. You see this on Twitter all the time right now, where somebody says X amount of people do things wrong, but here's how you do it right. Give me five. These are 5 reasons why you should do it this way. And it's like, okay, maybe your circumstances, but
Yeah. Don't use Twitter as a true north metric if you're trying to make a career in content writing. Please, 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 please,
but
please, please.
but didn't you know Twitter is a university? Have you heard that before?
Stop. Stop it. Next.
Yeah, I didn't go much further than here on the edits. But here says there is a design trend towards using more shades of gray for text backgrounds. Instead, we use black and white font to make contrast easier. Okay, that's cool. There is something in here. The minimum contrast ratio for text is 4:5:1, 3:1. Text is 18. This starts to get a little bit more confusing for me. I know what I'm looking at, but this is something where we can probably simplify this a little bit more. And there's a lot of why behind this is effective. And this goes back to that article I was talking about before. And it has to do with visual information processing theory and the effect age has on the eyes. So the quote from the article I wrote was, small font sizes and low contrast are the number one complaint for web users as it relates to reading online. Nielsen. Due to the effects of aging, at 40, only half the light gets through your eyes as it did at 20. And when you're 60, it's only about 20%. All readers, but especially low vision readers, experience better reading speeds when line spacing was set to 2.5, right? So we have an actual, this goes back into the retention and gathering of information that we were talking about before. Something up here that really stood out to me, and I didn't highlight this, and I don't know why, but not having adequate contrast ratio is one of the most common issues, right? That supports what we were talking about before, along with 84% of WebAIM's report. So Superpath's audit, as well as 84% of the pages here. Some of this is due to brand colors. Whew! There is a lot to unpack in that statement alone. And the major thing here, yeah, Kara says, it's because the eye lens thickens and yellows as we get older. Very true. Due to the brand colors, that is a huge conversation and a huge set of obstacles that whoever our reader is trying to advocate for has to overcome, right? So, like, yes, some of this is due to brand colors. That's why I'm here on this article. I'm trying to overcome this conversation of why we need to do things a little bit differently. Our readers can't see it because of the way that we have our brand colors set up. Maybe they're colorblind and our colors are the wrong kind of colors for color blindness. They can't see what it is that we're trying to do. How can we address that in a structural perspective, even if it's in a very small way, or even if it's something that links off to a different article about how to have these types of political conversations to get this type of thing taken care of? Now, that's part one. Part two, and this kind of takes a step back a little bit more broadly. Erin Balsa said this when she was on the show a while ago, that CEOs don't make decisions off of SEO articles. I 100% wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that SEO is a necessary evil and a great inroad. It's a great front door to the company. So if we have this as something where some of this is due to brand colors, here are some ways that you might be able to address that very, very quick. It gives you an opportunity to link to a piece that you write that has absolutely no search value whatsoever, like none whatsoever, but it teaches you how to have these types of political conversations to make a case for XYZ things, right? So if we think about search optimized content as a front door, how can we use this to jump off to other pieces that might not have any searchability or search value whatsoever, but is something that would be willing to get shared within Slack or private channels of some sort, because that's where decisions are made. So keep tying it back to the axioms, right? And then overall, we get down here. There's always work that can be done to intros, and there's always work that can be done to outros. I'm not going to like dive into that too much here, just because there's always work to be done, and it's always going to be subjective. Erica, I really like your take on this, which if you could mention what that is, that would be very helpful for the audience.
My take on conclusions.
Yes.
Yeah. So they should synthesize, not summarize. Go back to the introduction, read it, so that you have the original thesis and your primary claims in your head, top of mind. Forget everything you said in the middle. How would you continue the conversation from the introduction in the conclusion? Because if you read everything you said in the middle, you're going to awkwardly summarize it. And that's totally unnecessary. Everyone just read it. You don't need to do that. So yeah, synthesize, carry it out, give them an action item.
I like synthesize, not summarize. And one of the things that I like to think about when it comes to conclusions too is how do you get somebody amped up to take whatever that next step it is that you want to take, right? Like, how do you inspire? I like the inspiration side of that, but there's a filmmaking principle where it says, and it very much goes along with the synthesize, not summarize, where it's you end in a completely different place than where you began, right? So a great example of this is an old Western called Shane. And Shane, for anybody who watches, and pay attention when you watch a lot of movies now, like really well done, people who would like call them cinema, right? Not just movies, but cinema. Shane opens up with the frame is framed with a black and white, right? And when you end the movie, it's actually the inverse color. So you've gone from black and white to white and black, right? So you can see what this journey is from a very visual perspective that you've gone through, and it shows the transition of your character and overall the journey that they've gone on to. It bookends the entire thing. Really, really important with this type of thing too, because you're not necessarily you're not summarizing. You're going on that journey. You're showing somebody the journey that they've gone on, and hopefully they're in a much better place than when they came into the thing. Because if they're not, then what's the point, right? So I like to think of that. That's the way I like to think of that.
That was great.
Erica, thank you so much for hosting here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much for watching. If you like that episode, please leave a comment and a like down below. And if you want to be notified about future episodes, please go to thecontentstudio.com/thecuttingroom, enter your email address. You'll also get replays and other exclusive bonuses. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.